Hey there folks, I'm Alejandro Archibald and welcome to another episode of Eats by Jerome. Now today is a pretty exciting one because we're going to be talking about something that I've been really getting into lately, which is fermentation. There are lots of types of fermentation out there, but today we're going to be talking specifically about lacto fermentation. And even more specifically, we're going to be making fermented hot sauce, one of my absolute favorite things. So, let's rock and roll. Okay folks, so before we get stuck into making these ferments, let's talk a little bit about lacto fermentation. So lacto fermentation is called that because the real workhorse is something called lactic acid bacteria, also known as LAB. Now this is a bacteria that does all the work for you. Basically what it does is it eats sugars and spits out lactic acid. With lacto fermentation, long story short, the basic way of doing it is you get your ingredients, you weigh them out, then you add 2% of the weight in salt and you let that to sit. And then time and lactic acid bacteria does the job for you. There are a few rules though when it comes to this. Firstly, with any kind of fermentation, cleanliness is very, very important. Now, when I mean cleanliness, I mean sanitization, not sterilization. So sterilization means basically getting rid of all forms of bacteria on all your produce and all your equipment, while sanitization is basically just getting rid of most of them, and especially all the bad stuff. So what you'll need to do is make sure you have some clean hands. Now, you definitely recommend not using gloves when you're doing this, because what you actually want is some of that lab that's actually sort of in the air and especially on your skin, that's actually going to help the fermentation process. One of the things you'll be needing is some good solid sized jars. Now I really like using these flip top ones here. Now with these, what you can do, you can either chuck some boiling water in there and let them sit for a bit to sort of kill off all the bad stuff on there, or just a bit of hot and soapy will do the trick. Once again, they don't need to be sterilized, just sanitized. And with all your produce, basically what you want to do is just give it all a nice quick rinse under water, just removing any sort of excess dirt and grime there. The lab is a bacteria that's actually tolerant to acid and salt. It's also anaerobic, which means that it thrives in an environment where there's absolutely no oxygen. This is different to other bacteria out there, which thrives in environments with lots of oxygen. So one thing that's very important when we're doing this is we want to avoid any oxygen touching our produce while it's fermenting. And I'll show you how to do that a little bit later on. To get started, here's what you're going to need. You're going to need a few jars. I'm making 2 different ferments today, so I've got 2 of these. You're going to need your produce. You're going to need some good quality salt. Now make sure this is non-iodized. Reason for this is that iodized salt can actually inhibit the fermentation process. So just a good quality uniodized salt. You'll need some measuring scales, something along the lines of this. So this is muslin cloth, also known as cheesecloth. You can also use clean tea towel or even clean chux cloths. Have a few rubber bands handy as well. That's pretty much it. Today I'm making 2 different ferments. What I'm going to be doing is basically showing you 2 different ways of lacto fermenting. One way is where you can just add the salt to your produce, and basically that brings out all the water and makes its own brine. And the second way is where you're actually going to be creating a brine to add into it. So the first one we're going to be doing is, obviously being a hot sauce, we're going to need chillies. So I've got here a few red habaneros, some red cayennes and a couple of bird's eyes. Then we're going to be mixing that with some tomato, some onion and garlic, and my little secret ingredient for this is ground coffee. So I basically just got freshly ground coffee here, put it in a little sachet. These sachets you can find online or at a place called Gewurzhaus, which is where I got these from. And I basically just ground the coffee, thrown it in there, and this means that when I put it in the ferment, I can actually take it out and I'm not going to get ground coffee in my sauce, which is not what I want. I just want a little bit of flavour. For this first one, this is the ferment where we're just going to be adding the salt, and that salt's going to bring out all the water and liquid from the chilies and the tomato. So first thing we're going to do is chop up everything. Now you don't need to chop it up too fine because at the end of the day, once it's fermented, we're going to blitz that into a sauce. So just maybe chunk something along the lines of that. Grab a bowl, turn your scales on, and throw everything in there. The weight of my contents here, I've got 516 grams of produce, which means I need to put 2% of that weight now in salt. So go work that out on your calculator or something. So I've worked out the percentage I need of salt for this bowl, and that's roughly 10 grams. So I'm just going to add that straight into the bowl. And then once you've done that, you just want to sort of mix it all together. Maybe get your hand in there a little bit, and you just want to mix it until liquid starts to come out of there and the salt dissolves. Now you might need to let this sit for a few minutes. That's totally fine. It's probably a good idea to do that. So that one there, I'm just going to let it hang out for about 5 minutes, just to let that salt properly dissolve and for it to start sort of seeping out some of that liquid. Now that I've been letting this sit for a couple of minutes, you may be able to see a little bit of liquid has started coming out. That's exactly what we want. Now we're ready to chuck that in our jar. So grab your jar. I'm going to use a clean spatula to get all this in because I want to get every little bit of liquid and salt out of that bowl into my jar. Alright, to finish off this sauce, I'm going to add my little coffee sachet just on the top there. The reason I'm putting it on the top is so that throughout the fermentation, if I've decided that the flavour is strong enough, I can easily just take it out and let it ferment for the rest of the time. So before we go ahead and close that, I'm just going to put that to the side. So we're going to make our other sauce, and that way at the end I'll show you what to do at the very end with both of them together. So this second sauce I'm doing today is going to be a corn-based one. So I've got 3 good sized cobs of corn there. I've got onion, garlic, and because I'm the kind of person who loves, reducing waste, I'm going to be using some left coriander stems. And on that same note, for the brine today, instead of just using water and salt, which is absolutely what you can do, I've decided to use up some of the leftovers from the corn and actually make somewhat of a corn tea, if you will. So I've basically taken all those leftover husks as well as the corn silks, which is all the little thready bits between the husk and the corn itself. And once I boiled the corn, I chucked in the silks and the husks into there and let it boil for a little bit longer. And what we have is this little corn flavored water here, extra corn flavor should I say, and we're just going to use that to pour into the jar, and then we're going to be adding the salt afterwards. Now you can choose to use raw corn if you like, that's totally fine, it'll work just fine. I decided that I just wanted to cook them first because I guess in my mind it'll kind of improve the bioavailability of the sugars in the corn. Once again, just like the other one, we want to chop up our ingredients. And once we've got all our ingredients chopped up, we're going to chuck that straight into the jar, which we're going to set here on our scales. Now turn your scales on, chuck everything straight in there. Now for this one, the chilies that I've chosen to use are some yellow habaneros as well as 1 jalapeno in there, just for good measure. Now we put the produce in, we're going to try and squish it down as much as we can in there, and then we're going to add the brine in on top. Now you want enough brine to cover all your stuff in there, but not as much where it will actually leak over the edge when you close the lid. So now that everything's measured, so we've got about 1.137 kilos of produce and brine in there. So now we're actually going to pour the brine back out, and that way we're going to add our salt to that brine and then pour it back in again. So our 2% will be 2% of that 1.137 kilos. Okay, so I've just measured out the required salt. I need my little jar here, so 2% ended up being just over 23 grams. So I'll basically mix that into the water, the corn water, dissolved it, and then poured it back in. Now luckily with this one, the brine and everything comes to the very top there, so I don't need to use any sort of weight to keep that under the liquid, which is something that's very important because remember, oxygen is the enemy. As soon as our produce starts to be in contact with oxygen, that's when bad bacteria can come to play and just fucking ruin your whole thing. But luckily enough, it's full to the top, so that way the inside of the lid of this is actually going to push and hold down all that stuff in there, so that is more or less ready to go. Now with my other ferment from earlier, there wasn't quite enough liquid coming out of the tomato to make a brine that would actually cover everything in there. So what I've had to do is make my own brine, which is quite simple. Simple recipe is just 1 cup of water to 1.5 tablespoons of salt. Just dissolve that in and then pour it over your produce so that it covers it. Now with this jar I had here, there was actually quite a bit of leftover space at the top. So basically what I've done is I've weighted it down. Now you can actually get proper fermenting weights, which are like little either glass or ceramic discs that sit in your jar and they hold everything down under the liquid. I don't have any at the moment, so the other thing you can do is get a clean ziplock bag. Basically chuck it in the jar, open it up, put it in the jar, and then you want to fill it up with water. So what it does, basically weights down all your produce under the liquid, but also fills up all that space, that empty space there. This way, all your produce is kept under liquid, but it's also left enough space where gas can be released. Because of course, in fermentation, it produces a lot of CO2, so you need a way for the gas to escape. So I fill that with water right to close to the top, where I can still sort of fold that in and then close it. And then that one is ready to go. Okay, before we let these sit in the cupboard to ferment, there is one last thing you're going to want to do. Now, like I said before, we need to give these jars a way of releasing gas, but at the same time you also don't want anything getting in there that's going to ruin our ferment. So a good way of doing this is get our sort of muslin cloth or a clean tea towel or a clean chux cloth and just cover that up. And then either tying that with a piece of string or just another elastic band. Alright, and there you go. That is my 2 ferments ready to go. Now what we're going to do is sit that in a cupboard, somewhere where it's not too hot, not too cold, out of light, and that's just going to sit there for between 5 to 7 days. What I would do is after day 3, start checking it. You can start tasting it and seeing how you want it, and it's completely up to you if you want to stop it earlier or let it sit for a bit longer. It depends on how sour you want it to be. Now from my experience, I've learned that you should probably keep an eye on them and check them at least once every single day. I liken ferments to like a baby, You're so proud and happy that you've created this thing, but it also needs constant attention and can sometimes be a real pain in the ass. Hey guys, so it is now day 8 since I put my ferments on. I know I said I was going to take them off at day 7, but kind of couldn't be bothered. Whatever, the weather's cold enough that I was able to leave it there for an extra day anyway. So check it out. So as you can see, this is what my tomato and coffee sauce looks like now. I got pretty lucky because neither of my ferments grew any of that calm yeast. So it's looking pretty clean and pretty good. Got a good amount of bubbles and stuff there. This is what the corn one looks like now. Now it's pretty simple. All we have to do now is just strain them off to separate the solids from the brine. Then we're going to blitz it in a blender using a little bit of that brine. How much you use is totally up to you. If you want a more liquidy sauce, use a bit of extra brine in there. Otherwise, you want it thicker, just leave it as is. I usually kind of like that kind of pourable but not too chunky kind of sauce, so I will use just a little bit of brine. So what you're going to need for that, simply get a big bowl. You're going to need a mesh strainer, and what I've done is I've lined the mesh strainer with a bit of cheesecloth. Now another good thing to do, which I've discovered recently, is you're going to want to peg the cheesecloth onto your mesh strainer like so, using either these like little black clips or some pegs. Now this is quite important because sometimes when you're straining your sauce through, the mesh cloth will actually fall down if you haven't cut it long enough, and that can allow some other bits and pieces to go through, which kind of defeats the purpose of fine straining in the first place. Alright, so let's get straining and blending. So here is my fermented corn hot sauce. Got quite a good amount out of that, delicious. And this is my fermented tomato and coffee hot sauce. With the tomato and coffee one, I had some leftover brine, which I'm going to call tomato water. Now make sure you keep this stuff because this stuff is amazing. It's so useful. And it's great throwing into pasta sauce to add some great flavor to that. Otherwise, you can also use that as like an alternative to like mignonette on oysters, poaching clams or fish in it. It's amazing for all sorts of things. That brings us to the end of our fermented hot sauce episode, folks. So thank you so much for watching, and if you haven't already, please throw me a like and subscribe, and make sure to leave any comments, questions, suggestions in the comments below. Thank you very much. Catch you later.